Dan, water's ready for tea.
Great. Hey, you know what this reminds me of? What we're studying in science. Changes in matter.
Yeah, physical and chemical changes. This is a physical change. This would be a perfect
Episode for
Floating Science Theater.
On this episode of Floating Science Theater, we're going to talk about how matter changes, by physical means or chemical means.
Well, a physical change is when the appearance of a substance changes, but it doesn't change what it is. A chemical change will do that, but we'll talk about that later. What you start with is what you end with, just with a different look. Color, shape, phase, or size are all things that can change in a physical change.
It's a phase change anyway.
Good question, Jake. Phase change is when the state of matter changes from liquid to solid or solid to gas.
That's cool, but I want to talk about chemical change because that is my favorite.
Of course it is, because explosions are a type of chemical change.
A chemical change happens when matter from one substance changes into another substance. It will end up with different properties than what it had in the beginning. It breaks down the bonds and compounds, and it reforms into a different substance.
Doesn't it usually create a sound, light, or smell when it does that?
Yes, Dani, it does. During a chemical change, there might be a change in energy and or temperature, such as the production, which is exothermic, and the loss, which is endothermic.
Sweet, let's look at some examples of both physical and chemical changes. Let's start with some examples of physical changes. Like this paper, if I tear it, it's still going to be paper. I can always tape it back together and it'll be almost as good as new. And then this soccer ball, if I deflate it, I'm changing the shape. But I'm not changing what it is. It's still a soccer ball. Then some salt in a little cup. And if I pour water into it, it'll be turning from a solid to a liquid. Eventually, the salt will dissolve into the water, turning from a solid to a liquid by phase change. The salt's still there, it's just a liquid. So, and I can prove this because if I take this cup and if I put it out in the sun for a little while, the water will eventually evaporate and leave the salt in its original form behind.
Those are great examples, Dave, but now let's look at some examples of chemical change. The first example, rust. When metal becomes oxidized, it starts to corrode, which then becomes rust. The same goes for silver. When it gets old as well, it begins to tarnish. My last example is a match. When lit, it produces light and heat, which is exothermic. And during the chemical change, it turns the wood into ash or carbon. It can no longer be made into wood, which is a chemical change. The sulfur, which is ignited, creates a rotten egg odor.
What's that smell?
I think that's another chemical change. See, when our bodies digest food, it produces methane gas. And I think I know where it's coming from.
Sophie!
Now that is a deadly chemical change.
So those are examples of chemical change.
Great. So today we've learned about changes in matter, both physical and chemical. Stay tuned for another episode of Floating Science Theater aboard Sailing Vessel No Mas.
Jake and Dani